Coming out next, we have Pia Andrews, who's on a public service sabbatical. Is that how you describe it? Her presentation is called Lessons Learned for Public Sector Reform from the Australian Robodebt Commission. And a little bit of information about Pia. She is an open government, digital transformation and data geek who has been trying to make the world a better place for 20 years. She usually works within the public sector machine to transform public services policies and culture through greater transparency, democratic engagement, citizen-centric design, open data, emerging technologies, and real pragmatic actual innovation in the public sector and beyond. She believes that tech culture has a huge role to play in achieving better policy planning, outcomes, public engagement, and a better public service all around. Pia is currently taking something of a public sector sabbatical and is working as a strategic advisor to the public sector in AWS. She is in a newly formed team made up of experienced public servants who provide futures-orientated policy and outcomes-focused advice, support, exploration and experimentation to agencies and departments across Australia, New Zealand and Oceania. And I'd also just like to say thanks very much, Pia, for your continued support for Govis and for your help with preparing the program and many other things behind the scenes. So yeah, please join me in welcoming Pia. You have a slide clicker, green arrow, red arrow.
No worries, and being much shorter, let's pull that right down there. Tēnā koutou, no nunawa la hiterea ahau, no airani, no te mani, no purahia o ko tupina, tipunu. Ko tēnei tāku miti ki te tangata whenua o te rohe nei, ko ruapehu, te maunga, e te, gone, ko hinamaya, te awa, a rū, nei taku nā kau. Ko Pia Andrews, tōku ingoa, no rea, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm very rusty, been away a year and a half, sorry. But it's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much to the Govis Committee and thank you all so much for coming to this session. I should quickly say that I'm not representing my employer. I'm actually coming to you representing the Australasian Society of Computers and the Law, with whom I did work to create a submission to the Robodebt Royal Commission. And because I know the public service here quite well, because I know the public service in Australia quite well, I'm something of a translator between the two. And I know how big a deal this is going to be, not just now, but in terms of massive reform and change across the whole of the Australian federal government and states and locals. I know it will come to affect you at some point, so I want to give you a friendly heads up. So what I'm going to be doing today is going through what Robodebt was. Who here has heard of it? Couple? Not many. There you go. This is going to be traumatic for you. I'm going to tell you what it is, what was done. I'm going to tell you how the government has responded to date. And then I'm going to talk about the actual next steps and why it's going to have such an impact on a much broader series of structural and systemic reform that's happening across the Australian government right now, which is very exciting. And again, useful for you to know about. I'll try to translate it into what it means to you as part of the process. So Robodebt, what is it? I'm going to talk through very quickly what happened. This is the shortest possible way I've been able to condense this down, so please bear with me. So first of all, it was a government policy, government of the day's policy back in 2015-ish, 2013. What they wanted to do was to recoup $1 billion into the budget. That was actually the policy intention. Okay, I'm presenting this as a case study. I'm going to give you all the facts and lots of references. The goal was just to get $1 billion back. There was no other policy intention. There was no other public outcome. They're just trying to figure out $1 billion. So they went around all the departments and said, find us $1 billion. The MSD equivalent in Australia, DHS, very helpfully said, boy, have we got a deal for you, Minister. So they came up with some initial advice to their goal. Well, their proposal was that there was a lot of fraud in the system and they could probably get back that fraud from beneficiaries, and that would probably equal about $1 billion magically. So the initial advice on this proposal to recalculate previous benefits and then go after people who'd been overpaid, the initial advice was that the method to do that, I think called income averaging, was not lawful, that it would need legislative change. But they proceeded anyway. So then the next thing that happened was there was a recalculation of historical benefits with a thing called income averaging. And just in brief, people earn different amounts throughout the year, obviously. If you take just one fortnight and use that to average out the whole year, you're inevitably going to get the wrong outcome, a miscalculation, as it were. But that's what was done. So they used a combination of data from the taxation department, they did income averaging, came out with numbers, and then a very large number of debt notices were sent out over the next few years. Overpayments, and in quotes, because a lot of them were wrong, were framed as debts. And this is key. The onus of proof was reversed. It wasn't the onus on government to explain its decision. The onus of proof was actually on the recipient to explain, hello, such and such, we paid you, we think it's wrong, we think the information you provided was wrong, you owe us $20,000 unless you can prove otherwise. You can imagine a lot of people, our most vulnerable people, were traumatised by this. So the debts were also, just to really make it worse, outsourced to debt collectors, to private commercial debt collectors. So for a lot of people, of course, their phone number, their email, their physical address had changed in the last 10 years, because some of these were 10 years ago, right? Hey, you owe us $20,000 from 10 years ago. But all the letters and correspondence to try to get people to engage on it weren't received. So the first time a lot of people actually heard about the debt that they owed was when a debt collector rang them, which is quite intimidating. Or there was cases where people, went to the doctors and suddenly the money wasn't in their account to pay for their kid's doctor's appointment because the money had been garnished. Really quite full on. 80%, so 567,000 debt notices went out. Of that, how many people here sort of work in statistics or have a basic mathematical understanding? Oh, come on, more of you surely have a basic mathematical understanding. Anyway, false positives in a good system should be, Paddy, in what sort of range? Oh, a few percent, yes? All right. 80% false negative. Okay, so 470,000 of those cases have been conceded to date as being wrong, fundamentally wrong, completely wrong. Of course, through this process and over the years that this happened, dramatic increase in complaints, dramatic increase in people concerned, in not just from people, but from staff, from tech, from people across the organisation itself. Some of those complaints resulted in lawsuits. Some of them went to the tribunal. Some of them went to all kinds of different places. But quite often people were then settled out of court so that fault wouldn't be found. There were some very interesting behaviours that happened that have all come through the Royal Commission. AAT, our tribunals, actually found that income averaging was unlawful, and the person that found that then was stood down from the tribunal. The Ombudsman review recommended a review, very helpful, and it created sustained and extraordinary harm. Not just trauma and frustration and fear and intimidation and people not being able to pay for their kids' doctors, but deaths. There's about almost 2,000 recorded deaths that are associated with this. So legal challenges were bridged, so it's Australia's biggest civil lawsuit. It led to a settlement over 2020 and 2021 of $1.8 billion, which is obviously our biggest lawsuit. Well, not obviously, it's our biggest civil case. And they also found again that income averaging was unlawful. Very interesting. The new government coming in, which came in a year ago, as part of their election campaign, they campaign on running a Royal Commission into this program, into this scheme, into Robodebt. And that Royal Commission was conducted over the course of sort of October, December through till April or so this year. The report that is being handed down in just a few weeks, I was hoping it would be handed down ahead of this presentation, but it actually got delayed so that it could be, my understanding is, so that it could be, so that the adverse findings in it could be directly referred to the new National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is being established in a few weeks' time. They wanted the report to be brought out after that commission was set up. Read into that what you will. So how was it reported on? Like, how do people understand this? So I've got a bunch of quotes up here. I'll send this sort of stuff out, but I just want to read a couple of these aloud because I think that they're very interesting. In 2020, the government conceded about 470,000, a false positive rate of 80%, from one of the universities, which I mentioned. Robodebt should never again be framed as a technological glitch or a legal oversight. It was the active and direct exploitation of people's vulnerability from the conversation. The justice responsible for the class action settlement, Justice Bernard Murphy, said it was a shameful chapter in the administration of the Commonwealth and a massive failure of public administration. You can see that this is a big deal for us, right? And a big deal also for you, because as part of our session today, in the safe house of Chatham House rule, we're going to be going through and doing some scenarios. So get your thinking hats on. To this day, I still get anxiety when I think about my Robodebt. The government should care about the people who are struggling, people who have depression or money troubles. They should not put pressure on them and make their lives worse. From a recipient. One of the biggest surprises of the Royal Commission was just how easily many public servants, senior ones in particular, as it turned out, accepted that Robodebt was legal and properly authorised without basic checks and balances to affirm its legality before raising illegal demands for money. And this is key. This actually came from one of the deputy secretaries inside the department, she was amazing. Out of all the executives that gave evidence, she was extraordinary and well worth watching, particularly in contrast to some of the others. They had a strong view of the deserving and undeserving poor. From the 2014 budget through to 2018, the vast majority of my work involved identifying savings options to cut social security expenditure, from Serena Wilson. One of the interesting things that came out of the Royal Commission is they interviewed a lot of public servants, a lot of frontline public servants, a lot of senior executives, heads of departments, politicians. I think at least 4 politicians, including the ex-Prime Minister, was called to evidence, and that was fascinating to watch. But one of the things that really it did was it showed kind of the worst and the best of service. It showed some of the people who were like, well, this is what the minister wanted, so we just had to do it, regardless. We provided the advice and they ignored it, so we just had to implement because they decided it, which raises the question, if you're asked to do something illegal, do you do it just because the minister says? Or is there something above the authority of the minister, which we'll get into? But it also showed the best. Part of the evidence was given from frontline public servants, from tech public servants, from legal public servants, from Serena Wilson, from people who tried to do the right thing, who saw the impact and were reporting it upwards, who saw that it was not mathematically correct, who saw that it couldn't possibly be legally correct. And there was so much internal agitation to try to stop, change, or at the very least pause this scheme. So that was a very good thing from that perspective. Oops, sorry, it's just clicking on next for some reason. Would you mind right-clicking whatever needs to be done there? Oh, no, it's mine. Oh, there we go. Thank you. And just one final quote, and this actually was from the sub that the Australian Society of Computers and Law did. The Robodebt scheme has exposed significant cultural, structural and political issues in how public institutions have administered and managed public policy. Those issues were compounded by how technology has been misused. This is key. A lot of people look at Robodebt and go, oh, it's a great story of, the dangers of automation. It's actually not. You can have terrible designed policy. You can have terribly designed systems. But if you've got the right culture, measures, monitors and feedback loops, then even terrible systems can become good. And even good systems that, as the environment around them changes, can respond and adapt to those. So this is really a story about how we are structured to be, to the theme of the conference, more resilient to change and more responsive to change. There's a great quote by our current Prime Minister, if we don't shape the future will shape us, and that's, I think, where some of this is going. We've been looking at a lot of these risks and looking at things like AI as how are we going to react to AI, but actually it's more about how do we get to the future state that we're trying to get to, how do we fulfil our mandate and our purpose, and leverage these things in the right way, in the context and special needs and special accountabilities of government. So, what's been done since then? Obviously, there was the AAT findings and Ombudsman reviews. They have ceased the program. Yay. The settlements, of course, and the Royal Commission. But they also, and this is key, they ceased the outsourcing of debt collection. They recognised that maybe that wasn't cool. And there has been a major program, which I'll get to in a second, about reinstituting the core capabilities and competencies of the public sector, which is quite exciting. The reports coming down, the adverse findings, as I mentioned, but there's also a major, and this is one of the things I think will be helpful for you potentially, reform around policy practice and policy capability and how policy actually operates end to end. There is a significant understanding that set and forget policy is not working. So let's look at the current policy experience. You've got the policy team celebrating another great job. We got it out the door, now on to the next policy. But in the back of the mind, there's always the policy team being like, oh, I wonder if we could raise different ideas. I wonder where these policy ideas come from. I wish I could see it through, but no, on to the next thing, right? So the policy instructions go into the black hole of policy intent. Yes, I made all this up, but roll with it. So from this black hole of policy intent and purpose comes the instructions, and the delivery team, and it might be from legislation, a team inside the government, might be regulation, a regulated entity. Any idea what this means? No. Unfortunately, policy have already moved on to the next thing. Let's just do our best. So that then creates a impact, and the people affected by bad policy, it can literally ruin their life, but there's a black hole of policy impact. You have no idea what the impact is. No one's monitoring for the ongoing human, environmental, other community impacts. They're monitoring for whether they're meeting their policy intention at best, and evaluations tend to also look at the same thing. So eventually time passes and the evaluation team talks about, why was there low policy impact and real harm from the start? They should have just evaluated sooner, but evaluation's, of course, a point in time. So we have a really broken policy cycle, policy journey, and the gap between policy and delivery is huge. And of course, it's also not traditional. The gap between policy and delivery was brought in only 25, 30 years ago with new public management. Prior to that, you actually had a social worker writing social policy. Prior to that, you had an outcome with all of the capabilities needed to deliver the outcome. So there's definitely lessons from the past and from traditional public service that we've lost that we could get back into. And I won't jump too much in this because I do want to get into the table workshop. What time does this go till? 20 past. Yeah. So let's talk about failures. So my observation, we had a failure of public service mission, purpose, values and culture, clearly. When what you're doing is completely contradictory to all that, but you still do it, there's a systemic problem there. There's a failure of lawful and responsible administration, clearly. There's a failure of accountability, because even though all of those mechanisms for accountability did their reports and all found that you're doing the wrong thing, it still didn't change anything. So there's a very interesting question about how can our accountability mechanisms actually drive change? Not, years later. Failure of independent review. There were independent reviews from a number of different companies, but all of those reports were effectively kept in draft and never actually actioned. In fact, one of them didn't actually end up fulfilling their report at all. They just ended up doing a PowerPoint slide. Failure to understand and mitigate unintended impacts, failure to listen to staff, and no escalation mechanism for staff. If your chain of command just ignores what you say, the only other option is whistleblowing, which everyone is afraid of. And so what are the other mechanisms? How else can you report and actually get something changed? Failure in policy design, clearly, but also failure in policy responsiveness, policy iteration, and a basic failure in duty of care. Also, failure in political neutrality. So I won't bore you with this, but basically I've been trying to help senior executives across the public service in Australia to remember that what the minister says is only in the middle. Legislation and our constitution sits above that in terms of authority. Departmental approvals, departmental policy and implementation planning sits below that to a degree. But the idea that you only have a mandate if the minister says it, or that you can't do something unless the minister says it, is just not Westminster. So the impact of Robodebt on the whole of government in Australia, in the whole of governments in Australia, is obviously it's driving a shift in policy capability and policy practice. It's driving a shift in workforce training and public sector craft, and everyone having to be taught, maybe we shouldn't do that because it's illegal. It's driving a shift in how the executive layer is trained, how they're rated in terms of performance, which is fascinating. A shift in culture, shift in accountability and responsibility, very interesting. It's driving shifts in actual policy, not just technical policies like AI, ADM, digital data, etc., and workforce management, but also driving a shift to how social policy will happen for some time to come. And it's actively feeding into and creating demand for the APS reform agenda. So very briefly, the APS reform agenda, which you would have no reason to know about, but I can tell you it's the most exciting thing in the entire world right now, as the sort of nerd that I am. Quick quote from the Minister, there is work to be done in repairing years of neglect suffered by our public institutions, outsourcing, poor resourcing, clunky systems, and a decade of deliberate devaluing of the APS has meant that the Australian people are looking at our institutions with a jaundiced eye. In some departments, the public service became more like an administrative service to ministers, with core work like policy development being shipped out to consultants. I don't know how much or little of that sounds familiar, but the fact that the government of the day is acknowledging that as a problem to solve is quite exciting. So the APS reform agenda is going not just to, it's not digital or service reform, it's actually about structural, cultural, purpose reform. So trying to build an APS that embodies integrity in everything it does, that puts people and business at the centre of policy and services, not just services. You can have citizen-centric services, but if you don't have citizen-centric policy, then you're always the tail wagging the dog, right? An APS that's a model employer and that has the capability to do its job well. The amount of policy teams that outsource policy development to the private sector is not good, but whole chunks of core capabilities have been just eroded over many years, so that's a real challenge that they're trying to fix. And why is it going to happen this time? Because we've had reform agendas before, and the simple answer is pressure. Not just the Robodebt Royal Commission. COVID demonstrated the problem. We have a massive integrity review called the Coldrake Review. Of course, the challenge and opportunities of AI is driving demand for change, and of course, expectation change more broadly. So, a couple of key lessons, and then we're going to do a table exercise briefly. First of all, public servants are responsible for lawful, responsible implementation, not just good advice. Not just good advice. Frank and fearless advice, I think, has become a little bit of a barrier to good administration, because the perspective that, well, so long as I provided good advice, if they chose the wrong decision, that's not my fault. Well, actually, responsible implementation, stewardship of long-term public good is actually part of it. So the APS reform agenda is instituting a purpose statement in the Public Service Act in Australia for the first time ever. Will be a surprise to you, but, we are a penal colony. Our public service was set up as a punitive measure, and now it's learning how to be set up for the good of the public, which is good. But it's also setting up stewardship as one of our core public service values. It's not just about reacting to the government of the day, it's about long-term stewardship of public good, which is really cool. And of course, the voice will be a really amazing opportunity for that as well. The onus of proof is on government for government decisions, not on the public for government decisions, which is a basic premise of administrative law. And of course, here in New Zealand, you have Section 23 of the OIA about, a right to an explanation. So that should be a core business requirement and principle for all of your business systems. Evidence-based and test-driven policy could identify issues early, of course. Sometimes you need to say no to the Minister of the Day. Is actually one of the key lessons. Monitoring for policy and human impacts is critical to mitigate harm if you're only measuring for your policy. Robodebt is a policy that technically was successful. It did bring a lot of money back in. From a policy objectives perspective, it was successful, but it just goes to show that just because something's meeting its policy objectives doesn't mean it's actually achieving the right outcome. Our current fragmented policy model needs to be reformed. Working on that at the moment, that's a whole different talk. Feedback loops are critical. Don't outsource core government functions, not just policy, but debt recovery. Don't create unexplainable, untestable and unappealable decision-making in government. And public servants are more than just administrators. We have to be stewards for public good. So even if something legal doesn't make it right, and that line is one that we need to tread. So just quickly, and this is what's happening in Australia, is people are realising, just because it's been that way doesn't mean it has to be that way. And there's a real shift happening, which is, you can imagine that pretty much everyone below the senior executives feels vindicated from the Robodebt Royal Commission, because they saw their own. The frontline people, the tech people, the lawyers even, who were like, this is wrong. And the general public were like, we need to recreate this sector in the vision of these people. That's such a vindication. These people have been trod on for so long. It was really cool. A whole bunch of links in this slide deck, which I'll send out, including to the APS reform agenda. But what we're going to do is have just a quick table thing, rather than Q&A, because I'm not the authority of source of this. I just really want to raise it to you. But I want to do a little exercise with you. So if everyone could just sort of cluster around a couple of tables so you get more than one or two people at a table, please. And while you do that, I'll just quickly quote something from the Minister for the APS reform. At its heart, this is about restoring the public's trust and faith in government and its institutions, which I think is quite wonderful. So I was going to do two exercises, but we only have time for one. So I'm going to use this one. I want you to think about your department, where you work, right? And I want you to have a conversation, have a little kōrero about using the Robodebt scenario. If you were in this scenario, if it was you working in that department and being given that instruction and being told to just go and implement it, I want you to have a genuine conversation about what are the escalation mechanisms available to you in your context that would help you actually remediate or mitigate the harm, that would help you actually inform and change the policy, that would help you avoid the absolute disaster that we have had, not just for the public service, but more importantly for the people. Because here's the thing, if you can use Robodebt as a scenario, as part of your planning and part of your thinking, then you might be able to avoid the awfulness that we've just gone through. And that's my little challenge to you. So have a conversation. I'm not asking for a specific outcome, and you don't have to report to the room. There's no journalists in the room. This is all Chatham House rule. Have a think about how could you say no in the face of political pressure? What escalation mechanisms do exist to you, and how would you mitigate this scenario in your context, in your situation? Please have a chat, and then we'll get back together in just about 5 minutes. Okay, everyone, I'll just grab your attention back to the front, please. Okay, now I just need you to write down your answers with your names and departments. No. So hopefully that's been a stimulating conversation. The goal here was not to say, here's the answers. The goal was to tell you about this thing that's happened and to encourage this conversation, the conversation you've just been having. My suggestion is that Govis, we have nothing like Govis in Australia. Like, I'm trying to set something up because it's such a wonderful model, but it's a safe community of public servants. My suggestion would be, if this kind of conversation is something you think would be helpful, email the Govis committee and suggest maybe a few sessions where you could actually have the conversations and build them out a little bit as a community. But I hope that's been helpful. I hope that's been useful and thought-provoking, and please do keep an eye out and set a date in your calendars for the 7th of July, which is a day, it's either the day or the day after the Robodebt Royal Commission review is being handed down, the report, because it will be very interesting reading. And for those that didn't know about it before, sorry. For those that did, hopefully it's fleshed it out a little bit. And in any case, I do hope that some of the lessons that either that I've shared or that you yourselves will draw will be helpful in helping you to leapfrog and to help renew and do your own level of reform to make sure that you are being the best public service that you can be as well. So thank you all so much for your time. Have a really great day. Really appreciate it.